My name is Janean Sharkey, and I'm a master's student at the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of Guelph with Dr. Nigel Raine, and I'm here to talk a little bit about my master's research about how management affects native bee species in a rare habitat type, Tallgrass Prairie and oak savanna in southern Ontario. So prairie grassland habitats were once widespread across central North America. And in Canada, grasslands may be best known from the western provinces, but an extension of this once nearly continuous habitat extends into the Midwest and into southern Ontario. It's an open canopy ecosystem that is an intermediate between the extensive grasslands of central North America and the deciduous forests of eastern North America, known as tallgrass prairie and oak savanna. So there we are. So grasslands are one of the most threatened habitat types in Canada. This is mostly due to changes in land use from urbanization and agriculture. So less than 1% of tallgrass prairie remains in Canada, and over 97% have been lost in Ontario. So this is a map of southern Ontario with what is the projected historic range of this habitat type and the existing remnants that remain. So mostly fragmented patches of habitat persist, typically on private land as small remnants or as restored patches next to agricultural lands. Larger remnants can be found on conservation areas, provincial parks, or on Indigenous managed lands. So this is a video of one of my study sites, a restored tallgrass prairie. These communities are graminoid dominated habitats. They're composed of prairie, savanna, and oak woodlands. They have a high diversity of flowering plants, a lack of shrub species in the understory, and interspersed with oak, typically we're seeing in southern Ontario. So they're primarily maintained three ways with periodic drought, fire, and grazing. The vegetation that occurs there is adapted to fire, and anthropogenic fire history, that is cultural burning, has been important to the success and the extent of these communities in Eastern North America. So since colonization, fire suppression has increased, and this has caused fire-adapted plants and native vegetation and this habitat type to decrease. That's one of the challenges with conservation of this habitat, is that it requires active management to persist. So tallgrass prairie communities provide floral resources and nesting habitats for bees. And as we all know, bees are important for ecosystem health and pollination services for wild flowering plant species. This habitat type also has a high rate high diversity, species diversity, and endemism. And that is true with plants and insect communities, and it also seems to be true with bees. Therefore, documenting tallgrass associated and dependent species should be a conservation priority. But little is known about how restoration specifically impacts bee communities in this habitat type in southern Ontario. So my research focuses on how restoration and land management practices influence bee communities in tallgrass prairie and oak savanna in southern Ontario. Specifically, I ask if there are differences in bee abundance, diversity, and rarity metrics in naturalized meadow habitat, restored, remnant, or burned tallgrass prairie and oak savanna. So my sites were broadly classified at each locality that I chose into four management types. So naturalized areas have historic tallgrass community land use history. They were then converted into another like agriculture or recreational field and then allowed to naturalize. They were abandoned and the plants were allowed to just come back naturally. Restored sites also have historic land use as Tallgrass Prairie history, and then were actively restored either through seeding or weeding or other methods. Remnant sites have characteristic tallgrass and oak savanna vegetation with little management, and burn sites that I selected are essentially remnant sites that had a year zero burn. So they were burned in the spring of my sampling. So I focused on 3 localities in Southern Ontario. They were chosen for the extent of tallgrass prairie and oak savanna habitat. Pinery Provincial Park is a 2,500 hectare provincial park along the shore of Lake Huron near Grand Bend. It has rare coastal dune and oak savanna ecosystems as well. It is the largest protected forest in southwestern Ontario. It's the last known location for the endangered rusty-patched bumblebee, which I believe was collected there in 2009, and also home to Carter blue butterfly, which is extirpated. My next site is Ojibwe Prairie Provincial Park, which is near Windsor. It's a 65 hectare park, largest publicly accessible protected tallgrass prairie and oak savanna in Southern Ontario. It is one part of a 350 hectare system, which is an area of natural and scientific interest and a Carolinian Canada site, and potentially a new national urban park for Canada. And then my last site is Rare Charitable Research Reserve, which is a 500 hectare urban land trust and environmental institute in Cambridge, and it has a large area of restored tallgrass prairie. So my sampling I did twice a month from May to September. So each locality was sampled 10 times. I had 4 sites at Ojibwe, 3 at Pinery, and 2 at Rare. Unfortunately, not all the management types were available at each of my localities. I used a passive sampling unit, which consisted of 3 colored pan traps, 1 white, 1 yellow, and 1 blue, and a blue vein trap. And then I set out this sampling unit, 5 of these sampling units in each management type per sampling session. So just some of my results, I collected close to 2,000 bees from 153 bee species and 25 genera from 5 families. The most abundant genus was Ceratina, followed by Lasioglossum, and then Ogochlorella. I had 48 singleton and 34 doubleton species. So those are species that only 1 or 2 individuals represent them in my collections. I also managed to barcode all my nomada and most of my sphacodes. So this is a Venn diagram showing the overlap of species among the sites. So the species composition differed quite a bit at each locality. Out of the 153 species, only 27 were shared at each locality. Ojibwe and Pinery had 25 unique species, and Rare had 28 species that were unique to its site. So even though bee community composition differed between localities, those differences in abundance were not significant. When looking at management type, I did find significant differences between remnant and naturalized and remnant and restored management types. So this is a scatter plot of rarefied species richness and relative abundance. So rarefied species richness allows for comparisons of species richness that are standardized, and relative abundance is a proportion of the total abundance. So we found that restored sites tend to have had the highest species richness, rarefied species richness in this case, and burned sites tend to have the lowest. I also looked at diversity indices. So this is Shannon Diversity, which is a measure of richness, so the number of species in the community, and the evenness, which is a measure of the distribution of the abundance of the different species in the community. And I also found similar trends. So restored areas had higher diversity, next naturalized, then remnant, and then, and then burned areas. One of the most exciting things that to come out of this research is that I found a new genus record for Canada. So a pollen specialist, hibiscus bee, had never been recorded from Canada before, and I found 6 individuals at Ojibwe. So you can see on the right the distribution, and then I just added a new dot in Canada. And we wrote a short note on this with Alana, a former postdoc in my lab, as well as with Nigel. I recently got confirmation of another new record, a rarely collected Pseudopanargus, which also seems to be a pollen specialist on plants in the aster family. And this was also from Ojibwe. And then lastly, I have confirmation that this violet specialist I collected at Pinery Provincial Park is also a new record for Canada, which is kind of interesting because there's some estimates that 25% of the species in Eastern North America are pollen specialists. So do remnant prairies have more pollen specialist bees? This seems to be supported in the literature, and it's something that I could explore more with my data as I'm still looking at the results and writing the discussion for my thesis. There's potentially more new records from my collection, so I have to go through, and they're just some species that are a bit harder to confirm that my IDs are actually correct. So in conclusion, I found restoration does seem to support high diversity of bees, and that bee species composition is unique at each locality. So this underlines the importance of conserving existing habitat and not just restoring or creating new habitat and assuming that it will be similar. And that rarely collected species, such as pollen specialists, are associated with remnant sites. And overall, I think this just highlights the importance of continued sampling programs to serve as baseline and monitor trends in species distributions, even in very well sampled areas like Southern Ontario. So I'd like to thank funders and other members of the Raine Lab. And I don't know what my time is like, if I have any questions.